This is podcast 2 on Burmese Days for Honors 341 George Orwell and 20th Century Political Life, which is a tutorial taught in the Honors College at the University of Maine. I'm Rob Glover, the instructor for the course. So this is the first podcast that delves into a specific text, Orwell's Burmese Days. So let me go over what we'll cover today. First, we'll have a brief intro to the text Burmese Days. Second, we'll discuss colonialism generally and British imperialism specifically. Third, we'll talk about the British presence in Burma, which is the subject of Burmese Days. And then lastly, we'll talk about the dual importance of this text of Burmese Days, why the book is so important in relation to Orwell, and also why the book is important in relation to the theme of this course, 20th Century Political Life. So let's start with a brief intro to Burmese Days. This is my favorite cover of Burmese Days. This is the kind of pulp fiction cover, a saga of jungle hate and lust. And it's definitely focusing on the more sordid aspects of Burmese Days. You would not think that this was a work of serious sociological and political importance by looking at this cover, but it is very entertaining. We began this class reading Burmese Days, which you might notice is not exactly in chronological order. This is not the first book that George Orwell wrote, and it's not the first that he had published. The first is actually Down and Out in Paris and London. It was published in 1933, and that's a year before Burmese Days in 1934. So we step out of order a little bit, and there's a reason for that. This book, though it's technically fiction, is really based on the first major experiences of Orwell's adult life. And it was one that had a significant impact on his later development politically, and we'll talk about that a little bit at the end. The main character, Florey, is really, in a lot of ways, it's a composite of experiences that Orwell had while he was serving in the Burmese Imperial Police Force from 1922 to 1927, though there are some important differences. The first thing you might notice is that Florey is a little bit older. Right? He's been in Burma for a period of several years, and he's kind of reached middle age. And Orwell was very young when he was in Burma. He was about 19, 20 years old. So he's a young man, and you can see he's a young man in this picture, even though it's not the best picture. I think it's probably the only picture we have of Orwell while he was in Burma. So Florey is a little bit older. Florey is also not an imperial police officer. The main character works for a Colonial lumber company, and the eventual outcome that Florey experiences is not one that Orwell experienced, thankfully. And you'll see why once you finish the book. You'll see what Florey's outcome is. The other characters, people like Ellis and McGregor and Dr. Veeraswamy, the Wackersteins, Yupo Quinn, these are people that are almost certainly based on real individuals and personality types that Orwell encountered while he was in Burma during his time there. In fact, the book's publishing was delayed initially by fears that there might be potential for both the publisher and for Orwell to be sued for libel. So it's definitely based on his own experiences, and he's writing about people that he knew and personality types that he encountered while he was in Burma. Also, the book's setting, Kyoktada, is a fictionalized version of the village of Katha, where Orwell served much of his stay in Burma. And that's, you see a picture of Katha today, and it really hasn't changed very much. It's kind of interesting because there is this cottage industry of people that go to Katha to see it, because that was where Orwell wrote, and so they've read Burmese Days and they kind of want to get a sense of what the place is like, and there's really no infrastructure there to support them. If you look at this picture, the walls, the roads, many of these houses are probably the same houses that were there when British imperial rule existed, when the British were still colonizers. Not a lot has changed. Not a lot of investment has been made in that area of the country, and it's not the type of place that you would typically go. So people travel there, and there's virtually no hotels or places for them to stay. A lot of places in this area of Burma still don't have indoor plumbing or running water. So it's a very underdeveloped, very rural part of the country, and it hasn't changed very much. So you can go there today and you can see pretty much the same, in terms of the buildings and the place itself, the same setting that Orwell lived in. The book depicts Flory, the main character, his disillusionment with the British imperial presence in Burma, and also the psychological impacts of that. So we get a sense of his hopelessness, and he feels detached from both his colonial outpost and his home country of England. And it also depicts, sometimes really vividly and in ways that disturb us, the cruelty and the racism and the rigid hierarchy and boundaries which permeated Burmese colonial society. So it kind of depicts the internal experience, but it depicts the external experience as well. In order to understand what's happening in the book and to really grasp kind of some of the dynamics of the interpersonal exchanges, we need to talk a little bit about colonial rule and British imperialism. So that's something that we kind of need to delve into. This picture here, this cartoon, is really telling. It's obviously a depiction of Britain in various very stereotypical terms, top hat and British complexion, but it's depicted as this sea creature. I almost said octopus, right? But there's more than 8 tentacles there. Reaching out and establishing its dominion over other parts of the world. We see Canada and India and Ireland, and so this was probably Egypt is there. This was probably in the late 19th century, really at the height of the British Empire, when there was a British colonial presence throughout many different places in the world, and they had really kind of expanded their rule. We talked about this in the first podcast, how there really was a worldwide empire. Every region of the world had some British colonial outpost within it. So why don't we talk about imperialism a little bit, because that's something that might be a little unfamiliar for the contemporary reader. It's not something that we see to the extent that it existed in the 19th century today. Imperialism here refers to the British colonial empire. The British had established colonies, so they put in place a British political and economic presence in many different areas in the world, and they were now actively controlling these countries and exploiting them for economic gain, for territorial advantage. Sometimes they would acquire a colony or establish a colonial presence, not necessarily to extract resources, but because it was a strategic position in relation to other major powers that they were concerned about, right? To have a British presence in a certain area would give them kind of a geostrategic advantage. And they were also attempting to expand their culture and their customs throughout the world. So it's a multidimensional thing. The British colonial presence is primarily economic, but it's also strategic. It's based in security, and there's a cultural aspect to it as well. There's this notion that the British Empire is going to bring British culture and British norms and British customs to these other parts of the world. Now, empires have always existed, right? If you've studied history, you've learned about different empires throughout history, and major powers taking over control of other areas and occupying those areas. Usually, almost always through force, right? By coming in and essentially conquering these areas and then controlling them. And it's a little bit distinct. I mean, there's similarities, obviously, in what's happening in a later period in human history with those earlier forms of empire, but it's also distinct, right? And it's distinct for a few reasons. So we talk about the age of modern empire basically coincides with the age of exploration. As soon as we had the capacity and the technology to go out and explore the world, we began to put different areas of the world under our control, under our political and economic control. So, navigation technology, map making, and shipbuilding, and security advances, right? The fact that you're now fighting wars with more sophisticated weaponry. Once all of those things come into play, and once the Europeans really learn how to utilize those technologies and those advancements, they start to explore the world because they have the capacity and they can do so knowing that whatever outside force they encounter, they can probably defeat them. And they also begin to take over control of certain areas of the world. So starting in the 1600s, really, a little bit earlier, but kind of formalized in the 1600s, and continuing on until the middle of the 20th century, we see the creation of modern empires. What makes it distinct? One is the territorial size of these empires, right? Previously, the technology didn't exist to have an empire which literally, we'll look at the British Empire in a sec, but literally just kind of spanned the globe. That would have been infeasible in earlier eras because we didn't have the capacity to do it. So the size of these empires is going to be much larger than these earlier periods in human history. We're also talking about colonial rule across greater distance, right? So one of the major British colonies was the colony in India. Well, we had kind of, we were aware of India. We were aware of what was called the Orient, right, the West. But we certainly, in earlier periods of human history, didn't have the capacity to conquer it and rule it from literally thousands of miles away. New technology, new communications technology, navigation technology, weapons, those sorts of things are going to enable European powers to do that. So the second aspect that makes this distinct is its rule across a greater distance. And the third aspect that we'll spend a little bit of time on, because it's very interesting and it's very central to what's happening in Burmese Days, is that this modern empire is usually legitimated on the basis of some sort of worldview, some sort of ideology. And it's an attempt to rationalize, to justify what's being done. It's a more sophisticated discourse that's saying, okay, yeah, these individuals, we are taking them over. In some way, we're denying them autonomy. We're denying them self-rule. But it's more than simply conquest. It's more than simply, we want their stuff, right? There's something more advanced that's going on here than simply conquest and exploitation. Okay. Eventually, all of the major powers kind of get in on this game, right? So you see an image here that shows you some of the different empires that existed. The British Empire in the blue and the light blue, Spanish Empire, French Empire, all of the major powers, all of the countries that had the capacity to explore and take over areas in the world did, right? So starting in the 1600s, we see the British and the French and the Portuguese and the Dutch and the Spanish and the Ottoman Empire begin to expand. So that by basically the early 20th century, much of the world had been divided up into various colonial possessions of major, mostly European, with a few exceptions, mostly European powers. The last holdout really was Africa, right? There had been contact with Africa and a significant kind of penetration of the coasts of Africa, most notably for the slave trade, right? Everybody knows that, European ships would go down to the coast of Africa and then transport slaves across the Atlantic to the United States and the Caribbean and other colonial possessions. But the entirety of Africa, a lot of it was still unexplored. A lot of it was unclaimed. And in the 1880s, the major European powers literally just sat down with a map of Africa and started drawing lines and dividing up colonial possessions. And basically created the modern day boundaries of the African continent in Berlin, in a room, without any real attention to geography, to would this make sense as a country to have oftentimes very, very different climates and agricultural systems included in the same country, and also without attention to ethnicity, to forms of identity, language. So what you have in Africa today are states that don't really make sense. They never would have formed organically. They never would have emerged on their own. Nigeria is a good example. Nigeria has had a very torturous past with lots of conflict and infighting and instability and corruption and civil war. And a lot of that is rooted in the fact that there are just so many different identities included in Nigeria. I think there's something like over 100 different ethnic identities and language in one country. And you think about what unifies a people, well, language does, and identity does. And so to have countries that really are sort of artificial in their boundaries has introduced longer-term political problems for many of those countries. So if you want to understand why particularly sub-Saharan Africa has had so many problems trying to create stable political systems and foster economic development and deal with corruption and have elections that are not fraudulent and rigged, going back to colonialism is a good start. Going back to the modern creation of those boundaries is a good start. The British Empire, in particular, is really striking. So this is the British Empire in the 1920s. That would have been the time in which Orwell was serving in the Imperial police force in Burma. You see that it's significant, right? It covers virtually every major region of the world, significant holdings in still North America, South Asia, Australia. Much of Africa is under British control, British colonial control. Ireland is still a colonial possession at this point. The Caribbean. So it's significant. What's even more significant is if we were to look at every country that, every modern country that had had some sort of British colonial presence at some point, a lot more of this map would be red, right? Many of the modern day countries that we know today at some point had some sort of British presence. So it's a massive, massive empire, right? It's enormous in its size. It's enormous in the number of people and the diversity of people that are contained within these colonial possessions. And Orwell's experience is, one experience within a larger swath of empire and lots of different imperial legacies, right? Some of them more pleasant than others. Colonialism is always going to look different based on what the localized conditions are, what sort of resistance exists locally, how specific colonial possession is being exploited and for what reason. But this at least gives you a sense of just kind of the size and the scope of the British Empire. And like we said, primarily this is about resources, right? Colonial possession, having a colony as a means to extract resources. That was certainly the case with the United States colonies, right? It was a way to deal with excess population to a certain extent, but it was also the sense that, you know, the United States has these tremendous resources, and how can we create a system where Britain can benefit from those resources, it can extract those resources and use them for its own purposes. But the issue with this is that you have to find some way to justify it, right? So modern empire, we've advanced to a point, even, you know, by the 17th, 18th centuries, we've advanced to a point where we don't simply want to say that we're engaged in conquest. We're just taking over these areas to exploit their resources. So there's always a process of justification that's occurring. There's always a process of trying to create some sort of rationale for why you're doing what you're doing. Edward Said, who was a scholar that died a few years ago, studied post-colonialism. He studied the post-colonial trajectory of some of these countries that were under colonial rule, and he says that every empire tells itself and the world that it is unlike all other empires, that its mission is not to plunder and control, but to educate and to liberate. And that is particularly the case with the British Empire, right? There's differences in these European powers and how they construct their empire, but the British Empire was always informed by this notion that we're not simply exploiting these countries for their resources, we're providing them with something valuable. And there was real indignation and frustration when the colonial subjects, the people who were being ruled by force by the British colonial power, were not thankful for that. And you'll encounter that in Burmese Days. Another scholar, Noam Chomsky, who you actually saw in the last podcast, Invoking Orwell, he talks about colonialism and racism, right? And how the two tend to go hand in hand. And he has kind of an interesting explanation for it. I'll just read this short quote about the coincidence of racism and colonialism. He says, "There has always been racism, but it developed as a leading principle of thought and perception in the context of colonialism. That's understandable. When you have your boot on someone's neck, you have to justify it. The justification has to be their depravity. No, it has to do with conquest, with oppression. If you're robbing somebody, oppressing them, dictating their lives, it's very rare a person who can say, look, I'm a monster. I'm doing this for my own good. The standard reaction is to say, it's their depravity. That's why I'm doing it. Maybe I'm even doing them good. If it's their depravity, there's got to be something about them that makes them different from me. What's different about them will be whatever you can find, right? So there's a process of justification that has to occur, right? In the modern context, we can't simply say, we want their stuff, so we're going to take it, we're going to conquer them and oppress them. So you create this rationale for it, but in order for that to happen, in order for you to use force to occupy someone else and dictate their lives, you need to figure out something that justifies that, right? And so it'll be rooted in some notion of depravity, that they're not as advanced, as sophisticated as we are. We are somehow better. And so this colonial narrative really zeroes in on what are the differences? How are they different than us? And what's really interesting, right, is with a colonial possession like Burma, it's pretty easy to point out the differences. It's, you know, the superficial differences between someone who's British and someone who's native Burmese. There's racial differences, there's religious differences, they speak a different language. But the British also have colonial possessions in which those differences are not so apparent. So the Irish, for example, up until the 20th century, Ireland was a British colonial possession, and they would depict them very much in the same way that they might depict an African colonial subject or a Burmese colonial subject. If you go back and you look at cartoons, British political cartoons that depict the Irish, they're often depicted as very dark. They're depicted as having those same quote-unquote savage-like qualities that the colonial subjects in other parts of the world are having. So that they're depicted in the same way, and the British are always depicted as this more enlightened, this more sophisticated force coming in to teach, to provide for, to help these depraved, backwards subjects. Which is interesting because, if you were to look at the Irish and the British, you would not see much immediate physical difference. But the broader point is that there's this attempt to justify colonial domination, right? That's ever present in modern the modern colonial experience. You may have heard of the phrase "the white man's burden." That emerges out of this same period, right? The British are trying to justify what they're doing in terms of colonial rule, and there's a poet, Rudyard Kipling, a British poet, who Orwell actually read quite closely, and he's depicting this attitude that the colonial powers who were ruling over native peoples were actually doing them a service. And he talks about this in a piece that he wrote called "The White Man's Burden." So I'll play this for you. It's short and it's worth listening to. And then I'll talk a little bit about the notion of white man's burden and Orwell's response to Rudyard Kipling after that.
Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. Oh, take up the white man's burden, in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror and check the show of pride. By open speech and simple, 100 times made plain, to seek another's profit and work another's gain. Take up the white man's burden, the savage war of peace. Fill full the mouth of famine and bid the sickness cease. And when your goal is nearest, the end for others sought, watch sloth and heathen folly bring all your hope to naught. Take up the white man's burden, no tawdry rule of kings, but toil of serf and sweeper, the tale of common things. The ports ye shall not enter, the roads ye shall not tread. Go make them with your living, and mark them with your dead. Take up the white man's burden, and reap his old reward, the blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard, the cry of hosts ye humour, slowly toward the light. Why brought ye us from bondage, our loved Egyptian night? Take up the white man's burden, you dare not stoop to less, nor call too loud on freedom to cloak your weariness. By all ye cry or whisper, by all ye leave or do, the silent, sullen peoples shall weigh your God and you. Take up the white man's burden, have done with childish days. The lightly proffered laurel, the easy, ungrudged praise, comes now to search your manhood through all the thankless years. Cold edge with dear bought wisdom, the judgment of your peers.
Okay, so you get a sense of what Kipling is talking about there. This notion that it's the responsibility of the civilized and frankly the white world to take on the responsibilities of kind of shepherding the less advanced, less civilized areas of the world into all sorts of things, kind of education and advancement, right? And we're at this more advanced stage than they are, and we're going to take on these roles and responsibilities, and it is a burden, right? They will not thank us for doing it. Obviously, in the present day and age, we read this and it strikes us as, it should strike us as problematic, right? The poem itself was written in 1899. It was first written for a celebration for the Queen's Jubilee, and it was about British imperialism. And then he changed some of the words because this was right around the time of the Spanish-American War, and so the United States had just come into colonial possession of what is now the Philippines, and the independent country of the Philippines, from the Spanish and the Spanish-American War. So he changed some slight things and kind of, put it out there with that focus. But it's about the logic in the poem extends to colonialism broadly. And that phrase, white man's burden, may be one that you've heard. It's a shorthand for this notion that colonialism is an act of self-sacrifice. And it's not some sort of brutal economic exploitation. Orwell, as you know, thought imperialism was just a monstrous evil. And as a result, Kipling was implicated in that evil. So Orwell, in an essay that he wrote, talks specifically about Kipling. I'll just read you a couple quick quotes here so you can get a sense of how Orwell reacted to this notion of white man's burden, but also just Kipling in general. He says, "It's no use pretending that Kipling's view of life as a whole can be accepted or even forgiven by any civilized person. It is no use claiming, for instance, that when Kipling describes a British soldier beating a colonial subject with a cleaning rod in order to get money out of him," and he didn't use the word colonial subject, he used the racial slur that I won't repeat, he is acting merely as a reporter and does not necessarily approve what he describes. There is not the slightest sign anywhere in Kipling's work that he disapproves of that kind of conduct. On the contrary, there's a definite strain of sadism within him, over and above the brutality which a writer of that type has to have. Kipling is a jingo imperialist. He is morally insensitive and aesthetically disgusting. It goes on to say, it's notable that Kipling does not seem to realize, any more than the average soldier or colonial administrator, that an empire is primarily a money-making concern. Imperialism, as he sees it, is a sort of forcible evangelizing. You turn a Gatling gun on a mob of unarmed, quote, natives, and then you establish, quote, the law, which includes roads, railways, and a courthouse. So while Orwell certainly finds Kipling of interest, he does not think he's engaged in some sort of complex satire. He thinks that Kipling is simply indicative of the British mindset on imperialism, which is by definition somewhat sadistic. It enjoys inflicting pain. And somehow the British managed to convince themselves that colonial rule is kind of a tough love rather than an exploitative form of oppression. Orwell himself never pulled any punches in recognizing British imperialism for what it was. It was the subject of one of his first published pieces in 1929. At that point, he was still writing under the name Eric Blair. And in that piece, he says, quote, Burma's relationship with the British Empire is that of slave and master. Is that master good or bad? That is not the question. Let us simply say his control is despotic, and to put it plainly, self-interested. By the time Orwell writes Burmese Days, so about 5 years later, the question of whether or not the master was good or bad was no longer an open one. He answered it decisively. So let's talk a little bit about the British presence in Burma. It's an interesting historical period. It's not necessarily one that the British or the West in general ought to be proud of. So the British seized control of Burma gradually over the course of about 60 years with a series of violent wars called the Anglo-Burmese Wars. Burma at that point was divided into these different kingdoms, and the British had by that point established a colonial presence in nearby India, and so they gradually began to seize control of parts of Burma. They start in the 1820s, and they had seized the last bit of Burma that remained outside of their control, Upper Burma, in 1885. So this final moment of conquest is actually referenced as a childhood memory right at the outset of the book by the character Yu Po Kin. And he talks about, seeing the British troops and being a very small child and how he reacted to that, and how that is, I think he says it's his first memory, like it's his first conscious memory from childhood, is the seizure of his country by British troops. And Burma, it's worth noting, was not an independent colony. It was considered part of the British colonial holdings in India. So it was kind of dissolved into that larger colonial possession. You can see an image of that moment here. It wasn't particularly benign. This was a long period of violence and conflict, and there were lots of skirmishes, and obviously the British overmatched the Burmese in terms of their sophistication and their technology, and lots of Burmese were killed in the course of this fighting. The wars themselves were brutal. If you go back and you read, colonial officers or British political figures from this period talking about, how to carry out the colonial wars, you hear them talk a lot about kind of breaking the spirit, breaking the back of colonial subjects. And they went to some pretty extreme means in order to do that. They would burn villages to the ground. If there were areas that were known to harbor resistance to the British, they would just kind of level them. They would frequently engage in mass execution of dissidents, so people that had spoken out against the British or who had actively fought against the British. They would kill them, right? There was also, after they had established control of the colony of Burma, there was pretty extensive censorship and careful control of information, and they wouldn't allow anything that they considered to be critical of the British presence. They felt that if you allow that spark if you don't kind of stamp it out immediately, that fire will spread, and eventually, you'll have a full-scale insurrection on your hands. And you'll see some of that imagery and those ideas in Burmese Days as well. The reason the British wanted Burma is because it was a resource-rich country. It had significant petroleum resources. At one point, before we discovered, oil in the Middle East, at one point, Burma held 5% of the world's petroleum deposits. And so this is the point at which we're beginning to shift to fossil fuels, and this looked like a very attractive colonial possession. It was also a major source of agricultural production, huge producer of rice, and had some significant mineral resources, but it was and remains a source of timber, of teak, and I think it's still the world's largest supplier of teak. So it looked, from the British standpoint, from an economic point of view, it looked very attractive, and so they wanted to seize it, wanted to have this colonial possession. It made good economic sense to do so. Once the British had established their rule in the late 19th century, they followed basically a pattern of divide and conquer to ensure that the country remained under British control but divided internally. And this was something that they would do in their other colonial possessions, and it's a pretty well-established technique of colonial rule. Basically, you pit different groups within the country against one another so that they can't unify against their common enemy, which in a colonial possession, you always worry that the common enemy will be used. So you want to do whatever you can to ensure that you don't become the common enemy. By the time the British left, there was really no unified Burmese society to speak of. And it's no coincidence that Burma's history since achieving independence in the 1940s has been one of infighting and conflict. The British kind of united the different territories that now make up Burma, but worked very hard to ensure that the groups within them were always divided against one another. So since 1962, Burma, which is now called Myanmar, it's often referred to as Myanmar, has been ruled by one of the most repressive military governments on earth. I mean, it's a very, very rigid and strictly controlled society. It's a military dictatorship. And prior to that, they had had a series of internal wars and power struggles. So it hasn't been a happy existence since independence. And so when I showed you that picture at the outset that not much had changed, well, they haven't really had the capacity and they haven't had a government in place that can enact those sorts of major changes. They also would bring in Indians from outside the society altogether to perform some of the more sophisticated roles. So colonial administration, upper level jobs, jobs that required specialized education. Dr. Veeraswamy, who you encounter in Burmese Days, is an example of this. He's the medical doctor, but he is ethnically, he's Indian, and he's from India. And lastly, they invested in Burmese society, but they did so very selectively, right? So, for instance, they would invest quite significant sums of money in things like roads and bridges, what we call infrastructure, right? And they would do that because that was kind of like, those were the investments that needed to be made in order to pull resources out of Burma, right? So Burma has all this stuff that the British want to take advantage of, and the British want to export, bring back home, or send to other colonial possessions throughout the world. And you need to build some sort of basic infrastructure in order to do that. And a lot of these societies didn't have it. A lot of these societies did not have, modern roads or communications technology or those sorts of things. So they would invest in things like that. And many of the post-colonial countries that you go to now, I don't know, even if you've been to a place like Jamaica, right? Jamaica was a British colonial possession. You go there now, and the country has been so impoverished for so long, a lot of the basic infrastructure, the roads, the communications technology, those things are still, it's still the same infrastructure that was built by the British when they were the colonial holders of that country. And it's the same case for Burma, right? A lot of their basic infrastructure is still the same infrastructure that the British built. But they wouldn't invest in other things, right? So they would not invest in things like education, things like human health, at least not to, not on a universal scale. They were not interested in, taking very poor, very poorly educated people out in rural areas of Burma and teaching them how to read and kind of bringing them up to the level of a British education. They wanted to educate a local elite, and they often did. But widespread education, widespread investment in health just wasn't their interest. They didn't need to do that. They needed some capable people within the country that could help them run this conveyor belt of resources leaving the country. But they did not need widespread health, they did not need widespread education, and they didn't really invest in those things. So that's what we have, right? That is the context in which Orwell is writing Burmese Days, and it's the system, it's the machinery in which he is participating. It's kind of an odious situation that Orwell inherits when he goes to Burma in 1922, and it's important to keep that historical context in mind when you're reading Burmese Days, or really you're interpreting anything that Orwell has to say about colonialism or the British Empire. It's a theme that he would return to at various points in his other works. He would mention British imperialism and his experience in Burma. So, how does Burmese Days help us understand Orwell? Two key ways. The first is that this is a major moment of political awakening for Orwell. He realizes that imperialism is wrong, that it is fundamentally wrong, and he realizes that he's taking part in what is an injustice, right? That he is doing something reprehensible. Like I said, he returns to this experience throughout his writing for the rest of his life. His experience in Burma comes up. It's kind of inscribed in his mind. And he feels as if he was actively participating in something evil. He begins the book, The Road to Wigan Pier, with a reflection on imperialism, which is weird because it's a book about coal miners in northern England, right? You would think it has nothing to do with imperialism. But the image is kind of ingrained in Orwell's mind, so that anytime he sees oppression, anytime he sees suffering, he goes back to that experience of imperialism. It kind of becomes it becomes his reference point for when something is wrong, when something is being done that's that we shouldn't be doing. So I'll read you just a quote of what he says. I think it's really telling, and it gives us an interesting perspective on Orwell the man and how this time in Burma impacted him. He says, "The truth is that no modern man, in his heart of hearts, believes that it is right to invade a foreign country and hold the population down by force. Foreign oppression is a much more odious, understandable evil than economic oppression. So far as my observation goes, nearly all Anglo-Indian officials have moments when their conscience troubles them. The exceptions are men who are doing something which is demonstrably useful and would still have to be done whether the British were in India or not. Forest officers, for instance, and doctors and engineers. But I was in the police, which is to say that I was part of the actual machinery of despotism. Moreover, in the police, you see the dirty work of empire at close quarters, and there is an appreciable difference between doing dirty work and merely profiting by it." So he feels that he was doing something dirty, something evil, right? He's saying all of this stuff about the white man's burden and civilizing the backwards people of our colonial outposts is a fiction. And it's a fiction we tell ourselves to make ourselves feel comfortable with the fact that we're doing evil. We're committing atrocities. The heart of colonialism, the reason that we do it, according to Orwell, is to extract resources and economic benefits from these countries for our own gain. So it's a really important moment of political awakening for Orwell, but more than that, more than just kind of waking him up and giving him a sense of where he stood politically, it kind of sets the agenda for his life's work. Virtually every word that Orwell wrote from that point on, from his time in Burma and coming to grips with what he had done there and how he participated in imperialism, British imperialism, virtually every word was informed by that experience. So here's another passage from The Road to Wigan Pier, and this one I want you to keep it in mind as you read Orwell the rest of the semester. Just kind of think back to what he's saying here, because I think it really informs some of what he does later for the rest of his literary career. He says, "For 5 years I had been part of an oppressive system, and it had left me with a bad conscience. Innumerable remembered faces, faces of prisoners in the dock, of men waiting in the condemned cells, of subordinates I had bullied and aged peasants I had snubbed, of servants and coolies I had hit with my fist in moments of rage. Nearly everyone does these things in the East, or at any rate occasionally. Orientals can be very provoking. Haunted me intolerably. I was conscious of an immense weight of guilt that I had got to expiate. I suppose that sounds exaggerated, but if you do for 5 years a job that you thoroughly disapprove of, you will probably feel the same. I had reduced everything to the simple theory that the oppressed are always right and the oppressors are always wrong. A mistaken theory, but the natural result of being one of the oppressors yourself. I felt that I had to escape not merely from imperialism, but from every form of man's dominion over man. I wanted to submerge myself, to get right down among the oppressed, to be one of them, and on their side against their tyrants. And chiefly because I had to think out everything in solitude, I carried my hatred of oppression to extraordinary lengths. So it's not just imperialism that impacts Orwell. It's the fact that he's confronted and participated in oppression. And he realizes that he would rather try to inhabit the oppressed, to be among the oppressed and kind of live their experience and tell their story and fight on their side. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that that experience shapes everything that he does professionally and personally for the rest of his life, whether it be serving in the Spanish Civil War, whether it be writing works about the British working class, whether it be Animal Farm, 1984, his articles, his political sensibilities, the fact that he's drawn to socialism, all of those things are shaped by this initial encounter and participation in something that leaves him with a really bad conscience, right? That leaves him feeling as if he somehow had to make amends for what he had done there. So it's important for Orwell. It's also important in helping us understand 20th century political life. Colonialism and the fight against imperial rule really constitutes one of the major movements of the 20th century. There were others at Orwell's time who thought that imperialism was evil, but what he was saying was probably a controversial and minority opinion at the time he was saying it, at the time he was thinking it. Orwell depicts this pretty well in Burmese Days. Anything that Florey says that implies that the locals might be treated as equal, or that their culture is interesting and deserves to be appreciated in the same way that European culture is treated, that is received by his fellow Europeans as sheer lunacy, right? They dismiss him as a political radical, and eventually they dismiss him as crazy. They think Florey is, just speaking nonsense. So he's holding a position that's Orwell himself and Florey and Burmese Days. They're holding positions that are very controversial, right, at that time. But it is a time at which thinking about colonialism is beginning to change. It's kind of a pivotal moment. But gradually, we have a global movement that emerges. Movements rise up within the countries that are subject to colonial rule, but also within the borders of countries that maintain colonies. This is a really telling statistic. After World War II, so mid-1940s, nearly a third of the world's population was under some form of colonial rule. Right? So a third of the world was not living in an autonomous country. They were subject to control and forcible rule by some outside power. Today, only about 2 million people, so that's slightly bigger than the state of Maine, about probably the size of West Virginia. 2 million people are under colonial rule, and many of those remaining colonial relationships are basically voluntary. It's long-standing relationships. The colony recognizes that they probably can survive without help from some larger power. So that's really, really significant. That's a significant change to have happen in basically we're talking about 60 years, right? A little over 60 years. That fundamentally changes the nature of global politics. Right? The fact that you have these independent sovereign countries that are no longer colonial possessions, and the former colonial superpowers no longer have these giant empires that they're maintaining. It's not to say that those countries have thrived. Some have. Some, such as India, they've managed to prosper economically. They're among the world's rising powers. They certainly still have, huge problems with political conflict and poverty, but they're kind of emerging powers. Others, and here we could think of sub-Saharan Africa, they've been torn apart by the societal divisions and corruption that initially emerged under colonial rule. And Burma is no exception, right? So Burma, you look at it, its characteristics, it's a resource-rich country. It has a long and storied history and a fascinating culture, but the period since independence has really been an utter nightmare for those that live there. And so that remains the case today. So this is an injustice, and it's an injustice that Orwell identifies. And he identifies it at a point in which it was kind of not the norm for Europeans to be talking about how evil colonial rule is. But it's an injustice also that lingers, right? So if we want to understand why the world is so violent, or why certain areas of the world are so underdeveloped, why certain countries just seem functionally incapable of establishing a government that respects human rights or creates economic opportunity for all of its citizens, or respects rule of law, adheres to basic democratic practices and institutions, many would say, well, yeah, that's been a challenge for lots of places in the world, but in order to understand why that's been so difficult, you need to go back and start by looking at the practice of colonialism and the problems that set in motion, really from the birth of some of these countries, which were literally just lines drawn on the map by European powers, without any attention to what exactly they were creating and its long-term, its potential for long-term stability or prosperity. So it's an important and lasting. It has an important and lasting impact on global politics today. So we'll wrap up there. I hope that gives you kind of a basic snapshot of the context in which the book resides. We do spend 2 weeks with Burmese Days, and hopefully this podcast has given you some things to think about. There's also reading questions to help you grapple with what's important in Burmese Days and what you should be zeroing in on for each of the week's reading assignments. So there's week 1's reading questions and week 2's reading questions. So I'm looking forward to our discussions of this text. I really enjoy Burmese Days. I had not read it for actually since probably when I was about your age, and I hadn't read it for years, a decade. And I went back and read it, and I was surprised at how much I remembered, and I kind of remembered what an impact the text had had on me. So hopefully you have the same experience. You enjoy reading it. We have some good conversations. So I look forward to talking about it with you. Thanks.